be screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 56th part of, What If Harry Potter Meets My Little Pony? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of tkepner on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. They had settled into a Hogwarts routine rather easily, fear of the diary notwithstanding. The routine was comforting, albeit a bit boring, sometimes. However, Harry had learned his lesson about wishing things weren't boring. Oh, yes, he had. Well, boring for his friends. Not so for the other ponies. The change to the grading system, separating the humans from the ponies, had been a surprise to everyone. Following that was the change of detentions from being extra learning lessons to downright boring historical assignments. For many of the ponies, discovering the very violent history of the humans was stomach-churning. Reading what they sometimes did to each other was enough to get the pony rule-breaking almost eliminated. That hadn't, however, prevented a group of the Pegasi from corralling a doxy colony in the attic, and attempting to domesticate them. Subsequently, Rule 8 was modified. 8. Students are not allowed to play with dangerous beasts inside Hogwarts, its grounds, or the lake, without the direct supervision of a professor. For the purposes of this rule, Hagrid is a qualified staff member. And, in a rare show of foresight, a new rule was posted. 16. Students are required to get permission from a staff member with suitable qualifications, experience, and attitude before bringing any dangerous beasts from home. 1. For the purposes of this rule, Hagrid is not a qualified staff member. Hogwarts staff are the arbiters of whether a beast is dangerous. 1. For the purposes of this rule, Hagrid is not a qualified arbiter. Hogwarts staff are the arbiters of whether an animal is a beast. 1. For the purposes of this rule, Hagrid is not a qualified arbiter. Students are not allowed to take home with them, or send home, dangerous beasts from the Forbidden Forest to demonstrate the difference between their forest and ours. Rules 16a and b from above apply. Students are not allowed to have dangerous beasts sent to them from home. Rules 16a and b from above apply. Students are not allowed to send dangerous beasts to school ahead of themselves. Rules 16a and b from above apply. Then it was February. Hearts and Hooves Day. Valentine's Day on this side of the portal was fast approaching and Harry didn't know what to do. Blue Blood had been quite explicit about what would and would not be appropriate things to do and say on that day. At the very least his herdmates the three fillies for sure, and very probably Hermione and Ginny, based on what had been happening since this day last year, expected cards that expressed his sentiment. The first problem was, just what was his sentiment? He was extremely relieved that the three fillies wouldn't end up quarreling, and that he wouldn't end up losing two friends just because he liked the third a tiny bit more. Hermione and Ginny left him confused, however. He wasn't certain they understood that the three fillies weren't vying for his attention the way the other fillies in the castle seemed to assume. The three fully intended to marry him. He wasn't sure how that would work, but Blue Blood had assured him that ponies did that all the time without any troubles, or, at least, none that were worth worrying about. Harry hadn't really noticed such things, before, in Equestria. They simply hadn't been anything he thought about. It didn't help that most of his mum's friends were all single and the ones that were married were in monogamous relationships. Well, he thought they were monogamous. Maybe they weren't and he simply hadn't noticed. He still wasn't sure why the fillies hung around him. It had been quite a shock to discover that they liked him more than as a friend. He had never even had friends, before Equestria. The thought that some pony might want to be more than that was inexplicable. How could there be more than being a friend? The real problem was, what did he feel towards them? He liked them, that was for sure. Waking in a pony pile with them was definitely something that made him feel warm inside, and he didn't mean as in temperature. If he didn't see them for a while, it was always a relief and joy when they did get back together. He couldn't imagine not being involved in their shenanigans. The thought of never seeing them again left a hollow feeling in his stomach, and he couldn't really imagine not seeing them again. They were the first ones he thought of when waking, and the last at night going to sleep. When they were sad, he wanted to make them happy. When they were happy, he just wanted to bask in the glow of their happiness. But what did that mean? Did that mean they were family? He had never had a brother or sister, and his cousin had prevented him from getting close to other colts and fillies who did have siblings, so he had no examples. His cousin certainly wasn't a good example, what with the way he had always belittled and bullied him, and did everything he could to make Harry miserable. That all three agreed they wanted to be more than friends with him left him a loss as to what he should expect or do. Blue Blood hadn't had the experience of a polymarriage himself, but from the ponies he had shared drinks with over the years, it hadn't seemed to be an issue. By the time a mare joined a herd, all of the mares knew where each stood, what each gained, and what each had to compromise on. But did the two human fillies understand that? Did he dare ask? Or had the five already hashed that out among themselves? Should he just assume that everything was settled? If it wasn't, then he hoped his defense that he was a clueless stallion would suffice. But back to what to do. Cards for each of them was a given. He wasn't a poet, but surely the library had something he could crib from, right? Blue Blood had said that candy for the fillies was acceptable, almost demanded if the fillies were in a hurting mood. Sirius had also said that getting fillies candy was never a bad idea. He also suggested flower arrangements, but that Harry had to be careful of what Sirius called flower messages. For example, Sirius had told him that a red rose meant love or respect, while an orange lily could mean you hated someone. Putting both together in a bouquet? What did that mean? Except, maybe, that he had made a tremendous mistake. So, while Hermione might like flowers for the flowers, Ginny and all the other purebloods would read a message into whatever he might give them. The fillies, naturally, would assume the flowers were interesting snacks to go with the candy. He cradled his head in his hooves. He wondered what message a chocolate rose with a peppermint stem would send. His stomach growled. That he was hungry? Any kind of jewelry was out of the question, at this point, according to both of his experts. Blue Blood said, in view of his previous gifts of the rings, that more jewelry from him was uncalled for, even vulgar. It would be taken as him bragging about how rich he was. Which was quite gauche for a member of the nobility such as himself, now that he had been adopted by his mum. Sirius had concurred. Jewelry from the Mares would be more acceptable. However, at this stage of their relationship, anything more than small trinkets would be considered premature by the adults. Sirius had said that, for the purebloods, giving jewelry on Valentine's Day was a serious statement of intent. A wedding would be expected in the summer, if either side gave jewelry, even simple earrings or bracelets. Best to avoid that as much as possible. After much consideration, Harry decided on white and red roses with white heather to accompany his cards. The roses said unity, they were a herd. The heather was both protection and wishes will come true. Ginny would read the second as first, as would most of the purebloods. He didn't understand the dynamics of a herd, yet, but he wasn't going to tell her no, right off the bat, for no real reason. That Valentine's Day morning, in the Gryffindor common room, everything went as he had planned and hoped. He presented the fillies with the cards he had meticulously made. The chocolates, all ordered from Hogsmeade, were well received. He had practiced the third-year Reductio and Engorgio charms just for this occasion to present the flower arrangements without having to make multiple trips to his room. They had come with a stasis charm on them so that they stayed as fresh as when they had been delivered again, all ordered from Hogsmeade. There were quite a few ahs, and compliments from other fillies in the common room. The purebloods all sighed at the flowers. Hermione and Ginny had pinked a bit, while Ginny's eyes had turned a bit watery. Harry figured that Ginny would clue the others into the meaning of the flowers soon enough. It appeared, from what he could observe, that the equestrian fillies were taking full advantage of Valentine's Day. The older Hogwarts colts were almost under siege as the fillies made clear that they were not limiting their choices to the colts in their age group. Neither were the fillies limiting themselves to one. After all, who knew if the one they selected would be interested in them? Better to explore several and pick the one with the most potential for a good match in the future. All 5 fillies made sure to hug him and give him a kiss on the cheek. The group of them were skipping and grinning the entire way to the Great Hall. Which was where things started to go pear-shaped. The walls were covered with large, lurid pink flowers. From the pale blue ceiling heart-shaped confetti was falling and slowly collecting on the exposed food. Harry led the way to the Gryffindor table. Ron, who had rushed on ahead of them when Harry started handing out the Valentine cards in the common room, was sitting, looking sickened. He was holding a small shield spell over their section of the table to keep their food from acquiring any more unwelcome additions. At first, the fillies seemed to have the giggles at the state of the hall. But Hermione quickly noticed and took offense at the unsanitary pollution of their meal, to which she loudly proclaimed her disgust. She used a soft wind from her wand to blow away what she could while the others either tried to help her or added their shields to Ron's. Fortunately, the second years were well accomplished with that spell from all their practice last year. They extended their coverage to the first years who were still struggling with the spell. "So, what's this all about?" Harry asked, sitting down and blowing a stubborn piece of confetti off a rasher of bacon. Ron, too appalled to speak, gave a disgusted look at the teachers' table. The teachers were stony-faced to either side of the widely grinning Lockhart. He was wearing lurid pink robes to match the decorations, and waving for silence. From even this far, Harry could see a muscle twitch in Professor McGonagall's cheek. Snape looked as if he had just drunk a most repulsive potion. "Happy Valentine's Day!" Lockhart shouted, with his arms widespread, and then he explained. Harry was surprised to hear that 46 people had sent the wizard cards. He actually had expected for more of their female population to have done so. Then Lockhart bragged about arranging the decorations in the hall. Harry could only bury his head in his arms as the daft wizard announced that dwarves would be accepting and delivering Valentine cards. As they came into the hall in response to Lockhart's clapping his hands, he saw that the professor had somehow convinced the dwarves to wear golden wings and carry harps while wearing what could charitably be called a baby's diaper. They did not look happy. But that wasn't the worst. No, the worst was that they would be singing the Valentines. The DADA professor did not endear himself to Professor Snape, Slughorn, or Flitwick by suggesting that two would be a good source for instructions on love potions and the other might share his knowledge of entrancing enchantments. All 3 professors gave him appalled looks, and then glares into the hall that promised attentions to any student who dared approach them about anything that wasn't directly related to today's classes. All day long, the dwarfs kept barging into their classes to deliver Valentines, to the annoyance of the teachers. It also made for a madhouse in the corridors as people tried to catch the attention of the dwarves to commission a Valentine, other people tried to avoid getting a Valentine, and the dwarves rushed about between classes trying to deliver their messages before the next class started. They embarrassed students by the score. Their surly attitude was a surreal contrast to the syrupy sweet and awful poetry they recited. Usually while they were sitting on the person to whom the poem was addressed, because that was the only way they could get the silly sots to listen. Harry wondered if he was slowly losing the plot. Ever since those dwarves had been in the castle, he could swear that he kept seeing unicorns in some of the portraits that lined the corridors. There were a few landscapes that featured unicorns, of course. However, he kept seeing a white unicorn, always in the background and peeping from behind the scenery, that looked suspiciously as if it was trying to hide faint lines that seemed to indicate wings. And he could swear that he had seen the vague shape of a black unicorn whose eyes were staring at him from a painting of a moonlit forest glade. But he knew that the portraits were all locked, so it couldn't be any of the Pegasi sneaking into them with fake horns. Now that they weren't expecting someone to jump out at them from behind armored suits, their attention turned to their DADA professor. From the books and movies, Lockhart was a bumbling, ineffectual, charlatan. However, their experiences in his classes had shown him not to be the first two. Harry's bone removal earlier in the year had been an accident. The spell he had used was especially finicky, and making the tiniest mistake could get the result Harry had suffered. Unfortunately, his mum had told him, the ponies were not yet adept enough to pursue the leads provided in the books to see if he had really stolen the stories from others. All they could do was watch his every action as carefully as possible. It wasn't like traveling in Equestria, unfortunately, where there were no restrictions. Here, they had to negotiate with multiple governments, not all of whom were all that friendly. His failure to actually follow the order of the chapters in Miranda Goshawk's The Standard Book of Spells Grade 2 seemed to support the argument that he was a fake. Of course, his use of the situations in his books to get them to suggest various spells and tactics muddied the waters more than a little bit. Still, at the rate they were going, they would definitely not learn all the spells in the book. As a result, they had begun going through that book on their own. Again they had used part of their summer halls to read ahead. With book walking, it was surprisingly easy to revise the spells. That was especially true because they devoted more time than just the 3 days a week they had in classes. Which was probably a good idea, considering the end-of-year tests were coming up. Hermione was especially stoked about that. Pooling their resources made the written work in the other classes quicker and easier, so they had the time to spare. Hermione, meanwhile, had started scanning through Lockhart's books looking for inconsistencies and tabulating the results. Professor Lockhart didn't act or say anything out of the ordinary during his classes. That didn't prevent the 8 of them watching him like hawks searching for a mouse in a meadow below them. Once more, Harry found himself reflexively, and extensively, checking his food for poisons at lunch. He had been slacking lately, just checking once with a simple "is it safe" spell. The other Gryffindors saw him and his herdmates doing that. The more suspicious ones hesitantly checked their own dishes, again. After all, if Harry Potter suddenly started using detection charms on his food, and the twins weren't in sight, maybe he knew something they didn't. Reinforcing that disquiet were Hermione's actions. She was very busy that first week after Valentine's Day. It wasn't that unusual for her to read during mealtimes. But for her to be diving in and out of the DADA books, rapidly switching back and forth between the open books spread around her. She was obviously, urgently, and actively searching for something. It didn't make anyone feel better that she seemed to be getting angrier and angrier as she researched. Whatever it was, it meant there had to be a reason for Harry's abrupt wariness. Harry could only shake his head as he noticed the spread of troubled students slowly ripple across the Great Hall. First to the Hufflepuff table, then a few Ravenclaws frowned at their neighbors, and followed suit. Finally, ironically the very last, the traditionally suspicious Slytherins began checking their meals. The professors, those who noticed the rising anxiety levels in the hall, looked around, puzzled. The headmaster, by the way he was watching Harry, indicated he had noted where the disquiet had started. By tea time, that first day, the entire student body would be checking their food, Harry knew. Stories soon would be circulating about Harry or one of his friends or herdmates being poisoned. Hermione wouldn't have eaten at all if Harry and the others hadn't forced her to take a bite of something every time she emerged from a book. That, too, was noted, as evidence that all was not to the good. While she had read the books thoroughly at the beginning of the year, several times, she hadn't really tried to place them in any chronological order. She had treated each book as a separate incident, individual and alone, except that of the order in which they were printed indicated when they had happened. She had not considered the few dates mentioned as anything but markers for events in the book, so she hadn't considered comparing the dates between the books. Her conclusions. 2 of the books took place on opposite sides of the globe at the same time: Walla Walla, New South Wales, Australia, and Bandon, Ireland. Without a prodigious use of international portkeys, he could never have done both. But the books never acknowledged that they happened simultaneously. Nor that he repeatedly used international portkeys during the course of the stories, even though he would have needed to use one almost every day, and several on certain days. Not to mention being awake for 36 or 40 hours straight, several times. She and Ginny glowered at Professor Lockhart throughout the DADA classes. They made it a point to inform the other students of her research. The Ravenclaws were especially upset at discovering their professor's deceptions. However, he was the professor and they were the students. From previous years, and what their older housemates told them, complaining was useless. Plus, his approach to have the students bring up and discuss the various spells, and what to do with them, was engaging. It just wasn't really following the DADA book. Lockhart, however, never noticed their hostility. He was too busy being the center of attention. Neither did he notice that most of the witches in his class were casting questioning glances on him as they tried to convince themselves that their professor wasn't a scoundrel. Some were more successful than others. And settled herself into her seat in the Wisengamot Visitors Gallery of Ministry Courtroom 10. Several Wisengamot members had already arrived and were conversing in low tones as they clustered in small groups. The gallery had only a few spectators, as yet. The agenda for the day wasn't anything earth-shattering that would garner more than a yawn from the general public. The reporter for the Daily Prophet looked bored. No doubt he was the lowest reporter in the pecking order at the paper. If anything of real interest had been scheduled, a more senior reporter would have taken the chair so he could get credit for breaking a newsworthy story. It sucked to be low pony on the totem pole, and new. It was only as the Wisengamot members began to take their seats a few minutes later that the more attentive people noticed that there were considerably more seats being taken than expected for a dull session. Most Wisengamot sessions had little more than the minimum number in attendance, just enough so that no bills could be suddenly introduced and passed by a majority from any of the different political parties. The only bills passed in such a nondescript a session would be those that both parties agreed upon, a rare occurrence. And knew that 3/4 of the Wisengamot were in attendance today. It had taken a bit of devious maneuvering to arrange for that, without alerting their political opponents, but Sirius considered it galleons, and blackmail well spent. A few touches of her friendship magic had helped keep her at a discreet, but very effective, distance each lackey thought her suggestions were their ideas. The unsuspecting missing members who might have objected to the proceedings thought they had much more important appointments elsewhere regarding their families or businesses. After several boring hours, the item she had been waiting for came up. And had to suppress the grin that threatened to break out on her face. Their ploys had worked well. Only a few in attendance today would try to impede the scheme. A ministry employee had caught someone offering a bribe. In the Ministry for Magic, bribery was a well-used means of doing things. Want something to go faster through the bureaucracy? Bribe the right person. Want something to go slower? Same thing. Want something lost in the bowels of the ministry? Bribe several people, or offer a rather large, single bribe to the right person. Sometimes a donation to a certain charity would be involved. Nothing was sacred to those who idolized galleons and viewed the jobs as a way to enrich themselves at the expense of less fortunate or inferior others. Unless it was something really trivial, such as getting a flu hookup or license expedited, those things could take months. You had to get hold of a pure BLD to affect things. It was no accident that the jobs capable of providing the most bribe opportunities were occupied by purebloods. A ministry employee catching someone in bribery usually meant only one thing, that a pure BLD wanted to get a non-pure BLD in trouble either for general principles or for revenge. They would claim that the non-pure BLD had offered them something of value to influence a decision in their job. In truth, the pure BLD had tried to extort a wizard or witch, and the victim had refused. Sure, the pure BLD would lose a few galleons of off-the-book income, but the fine paid and the time the victim spent in Azkaban more than compensated them in their opinion. Not spoken of was that half the galleons paid in the fine would usually, under the table, be split between the accusing pure BLD and the ministry. So, no money was really lost. Naturally, the accused claimed that the ministry official was lying, or that the official had tried to extort money from them. That argument almost always failed. Purebloods couldn't be forced to take Veritaserum, the potion that forces one to answer questions truthfully. Asking someone, "What felonious crimes have you committed?" would force a defendant to confess their crimes. If they weren't guilty of any felonies, they would remain silent. Regrettably, if the accused had time to prepare, there were potions one could take to combat Veritaserum, or memories of a crime could be obliterated from memory by a friend. Plus, some wizards and witches were powerful enough in magic and will that they could resist the potion. As a result, Veritaserum could only prove someone was guilty, not that they were innocent. Because of things like Polyjuice Potion, illusions, and metamorph magi, witnesses to crimes were useless. Being legally able to refuse Veritaserum made it nearly impossible to convict a pure BLD. It was the word of a trusted ministry employee against that of a common citizen, usually an inferior half-BLD, half-breed, or Muggleborn. The pure BLD had to be caught in the act by Aurors, and kept isolated to remove the possibility of potions or obliviations. Special detection spells could remove the possibilities of illusions and metamorph magi. Sadly, even if they were caught in the act, the purebloods could claim they had been mind-controlled with a spell such as the Imperio. For many things, that meant they had an effective defense. Of course, using the Imperio defense had its own difficulties, as it implied the accused had a weak mind, which could backfire spectacularly in the cutthroat competition higher up in the ministry. After all, if you were so weak-willed, how could anyone trust a decision or opinion from you as your own? In any case, the Wizengamot members sat up a little straighter at the thought of someone getting their comeuppance. At the very least, it would be entertaining anything to relieve the tedium. She couldn't help but grin, both at the reaction of those in the courtroom and at the beginning of the culmination of 6 months of scheming and planning. The last 2 months had simply been arranging this event. When MDM Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and a square-jawed witch with close-cropped grey hair and a monocle, walked in with Arthur Wheelsey and his 2 SCRT, the entire hall quickly descended into excited whispering. Her appearance of a serious person matched her personality perfectly. Mr. Weasley had bright red hair, and was going bald. He wore glasses and had blue eyes, and also possessed a tall, thin build. Mr. Weasley was the head of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office at the Ministry for Magic, and a pure BLD from a family of long standing. While his office wasn't that important to the rest of the ministry, the man himself was well liked as a good-hearted, reasonable, and competent wizard. It took considerable work to anger the man. Some in the ministry, and the so-called polite society, considered him a BLD traitor because of his principles. Mr. Weasley was strongly opposed to discrimination against Muggles, Muggleborns, half-bloods, half-breeds, and cursed beings such as werewolves. He felt that how you acted was more important than who your parents were. The law, he reasoned, should apply evenly to everyone. No one should be treated better, or worse, simply because of their parentage. He did not think highly of those who advocated otherwise. In late summer last year he had even introduced the Muggle Protection Act, which had drawn the ire of the conservative members of the Wizengamot, most of whom were former Death Eaters or their supporters. They hated the loss of legally harassing the beastly Muggles at their whim. It had passed in October. That someone had tried to bribe the wizard known for his unwavering principles was astounding to those in the courtroom. That Arthur had taken it to the Aurors was almost as amazing. Whomever had tried to bribe the wizard must have taken things to the extreme, was their only conclusion. Otherwise, the affable wizard would have shrugged the matter off as a mere misunderstanding, or, considering his stories about his sons and their escapades, a prank. With the accuser being a pure BLD department head, it was only natural that the head of the DMLE would be involved. She wouldn't foist this onto an underling. The case, once Mr. Weasley was seated and MDM Bones had begun questioning in her loud, booming voice, involved possession of a questionable unregistered potion and selling a cursed, goblin silver tea set, which the accused had stolen. It was no wonder that the accused wizard had tried to bribe his way out of a stay in Azkaban. It started when Mary Twist, Mr. Weasley began explaining to the Wizengamot. A Muggle-born witch, interrupted MDM Bones. He blinked in surprise. Well, yes. Anyway, she came into my office in a rush. There was an incident at her mother's house regarding a cursed tea set. After steeping, if a muggle began to pour a cup, the teapot would spray alternating streams of ice-cold and steaming hot tea all over the muggles in the room. He sighed and shook his head. There were titters of amusement from both the Wizengamot members and the watching gallery. The red-headed wizard frowned and looked around the room. Fortunately, he continued, Miss Twist happened to be there and was able to get things sorted, but she wanted something done about the tea set. She had acquired the tea set for her mother as a birthday present, you see, and her mother had had a tea party with her muggle friends the following weekend. I removed the curse, it was rather simple, actually. Then I began tracking down the wizard responsible. Fortunately, she knew the wizard who had sold her the tea set, Mundungus Fletcher. He sighed. Once I had Fletcher in custody, it came up that the tea set had been stolen, and that he was in possession of an unregistered potion. There is a fine for selling a muggle-baiting item, stiff, but not that terrible. Plus, this was his first offense. He hadn't known that the set was cursed, but he should have checked, first. That it had been reported as stolen, however, made the case a bit more severe. Now it included a several-week stay in Azkaban, and a much stiffer fine. The potion, on the other hand, was not such an easy problem. First, he should have surrendered a sample of the potion to the Ministry Potions Department. They would have analyzed the potion for harmful side effects, and its efficacy at doing what the potion was supposed to do. Only if it did what it was supposed to do and nothing harmful and had only temporary and mild side effects would it be allowed to be produced and sold or shared with others. Most of the Wizengamot members were nodding in agreement. As you know, producing, selling, or possessing an unregistered potion is forbidden. If the potion's properties are severe enough, the inventor of the potion might be punished for inventing and producing it, up to and including being forbidden to make any potions whatsoever. That would be in addition to any fines or time in Azkaban. He leaned back in his chair. That was the sticking point for Fletcher. He knew that if a Ministry Potion MSTR looked at his potion, they would discover that it affected the minds of the drinkers. Nothing dangerous, mind you, they would merely think whomever was playing an instrument or singing was a better than musician or singer really was, which could influence them into giving him more money for him playing. He insisted he had never done that. However, it did have the potential of being badly abused. But he swore it was only because he wanted people to like his music, and he never used the potion with a wizarding audience. Mr. Weasley stopped a moment. Which was when he tried to bribe me with 100 galleons. The whole room gasped. That was the equivalent of a year's wages for the average ministry worker. I immediately hit him with a stupefy, and notified the Aura department, Mr. Weasley concluded. Thank you for your assistance in this matter, said MDM Bones, dismissing the man. I'm sorry we had to take up your valuable time. After the exchange of a few pleasantries, the red-haired wizard made his exit from the chambers, only to return a few minutes later wearing his Wizengamot robe, and take a seat. The room descended into outraged whispering and debates as to how long the wizard should be incarcerated. Not being able to pay the fine in full immediately would increase his stay at the wizarding prison by more than a few weeks. Now it was Fletcher's turn. His treatment was decidedly different, with an SCRT of 4 auras and his hands chained to his back. The noise level rose as he came through the prisoner's door from the holding room. Mundungus was a short, half-BLD wizard with bandy legs and long, straggly ginger hair. He had bloodshot, baggy brown eyes and hadn't shaved in several days. His hands were quite grubby, and saw, when his arms were chained to the arms of the prisoner's chair centered in the chamber. He was also sweating. Dumbledore had to set off a cannon blast from his wand to get the room settled again. MDM Bones was quick to tell them that Mundungus had been involved in many illegal and questionable activities, and that he had a notorious disreputable reputation as a petty criminal. He had had a number of scrapes with the Aurors in the past, and even one serious incident which had almost seen him in Azkaban for a rather lengthy term. The Veritaserum dose he received made him verify all the information reported by Mr. Weasley. Normally, that would be the end of the interrogation with a vote on his being innocent or guilty. If he was voted guilty, then a discussion for the proper sentence and another vote would take place. This time, though, there would be an additional question asked, and new, almost as if it were an impulsive afterthought. It wasn't, but no one beyond MDM Bones, Sirius, Fletcher, and herself knew that the trial had been carefully planned and choreographed for this moment. Even the Aurors in the chamber had been carefully selected. Administer the antidote, she ordered one of the Aurors who was several paces away. Just as he was about to tip the vial into Mundungus' mouth, she stopped him, saying, "Wait." She frowned as if she had had a sudden thought. Staring impassively at the chained wizard, she asked, "Do you know of any other bribery cases by a half-BLD that need investigation? Not your own, of course." She raised her eyebrows in sudden thought. Or, perhaps, someone who might know of unreported bribery cases. It was a crime to know of a bribery incident, or attempted bribery, and not report it to the Aurors. The noise level in the courtroom had been steadily rising as it appeared the case was sorted and all that was left was sentencing. For a normally dull Wizengamot, this session had been surprisingly interesting. At the very least they had some interesting gossip for the tea table this evening. In the dull monotone that all prisoners dosed with Veritaserum exhibited, Fletcher replied, "Dolores Umbridge." Abruptly, the courtroom dropped to dead silence as the prisoner's words cut through the noise. Then it burst into an uproar, yelling and shouting as members demanded to know if Fletcher was lying, if they had misheard, or that he had to be mistaken. Several objected that this was an illegal line of questioning. Drowning out any other names he said was the thunderous roar as the senior undersecretary to the Minister for Magic leapt to her feet and bellowed, "What?" The Minister, Cornelius Fudge, was seated beside her in the Minister for Magic's box in the Wizengamot section. They were below and in front of the Chief Warlock's podium. He looked on with an expression of sheer shock, gobsmacked at the revelation. "That's a lie," she shouted at the top of her lungs, pointing at Fletcher. The room was in pandemonium as members tried to outshout each other. The Daily Prophet reporter was taking notes furiously. A dull day that normally would have seen his story placed on the very last page had just given him front-page news. It didn't matter if it was true, just the accusation in such a forum as this was enough. The Chief Warlock, Albus Dumbledore, silenced the room with a tremendous cannon blast from his wand. "Order, please," he said slowly. MDM Bones had already stopped Fletcher, who patiently waited for the next question. "He's lying," declared the undersecretary, still pointing at Fletcher in outrage. Dolores Umbridge was a short squat woman resembling a large pale frog. She had a broad, flabby face, a wide, slack mouth, and nearly non-existent neck. Her eyes were bulging and poachy, with mousy brown hair adorned with a black velvet bow. She wore a green tweed dress with a pink fuzzy cardigan on top, giving her greater frog-like qualities. And had never seen a human who so closely resembled a member of the frog family. Considering some of the half-breeds she had discovered in the witchery world, and some of the things she had heard stories about in some of the more disreputable pubs, she couldn't help but wonder on the witch's ancestry. Primarily, how? Still, that didn't matter. What did matter were her truly offensive personal views of non-purebloods that she wanted to force on the witchery world. Views which would block some of the things and wanted to pass. Views, which if enacted into laws, would attract the attention of the ICW and not in a good way. Which was why Department Head Bones was helping Anne, to forestall a ministry disaster of monumental proportions. Dumbledore looked down at the witch. "This is the Wizengamot. Silence. Or you will be silenced. But that half-BLD is spouting lies. I'm a pure blood," she pronounced imperiously. "I demand he be arrested and sent to Azkaban for slandering a pure BLD." Dumbledore tilted his head down to look at her. Over his spectacles, and raised an eyebrow. The toadish witch crossed her arms angrily and sat back down, scowling darkly. MDM Bones turned back to the prisoner. "MDM Umbridge, the senior undersecretary to the minister, is a pure BLD, is she not?" Continuing in the same monotone, Fletcher said, "Dolores Umbridge is a half-BLD. Anne's research had discovered that MDM Bones had been in the ministry for several decades, almost as long as Umbridge. Bones had watched and listened as the Dolores had risen in the ministry after graduating from Hogwarts. The toad-like woman was a nasty person, and had no problems letting those whom she felt were beneath her know how she felt about them. Once she was promoted, she had used her position to take advantage of them. People who wanted to remain on her good side, both inside and outside the ministry, avoided her whenever possible. That wasn't a guarantee that she wouldn't savage them, anyway, but it did reduce the odds enough to make it a worthwhile effort. Those that did fall prey to her need to feel superior tended to have terrible things happen to them or they disappeared. In her first days of getting a job at the ministry, complaints had been many, but they rather quickly fell off as she retaliated using underhanded methods. Umbridge had been extremely careful in covering her tracks, which had made things difficult for the DMLE to rein her in. She used her pure BLD status as a shield to stymie investigations, claiming any accusations were untrue. She sharply criticized both the complaints and the people making them, always those who were beneath her. To her superiors, she was always polite and subservient to a sickening degree. She almost groveled to stay in their good favor, and rode their coattails as they climbed the ministry hierarchy. She was not afraid to drop names to halt questions into her conduct. The officials tentatively investigating always had to retreat, until it became well known to not even try. While there were rumors that she wasn't a pure BLD, she had been making the claim since she had first started at Hogwarts. Anyone who noted that one of the janitors at the ministry was named Umbridge soon regretted it. Bones, Anne, knew the woman wasn't really a pure BLD, despite the witch's insistence, ever since she started Hogwarts, that she was. All the evidence in the ministry of her true ancestry had, mysteriously, disappeared or been lost, as misfiled. The head of the DMLE knew that nasty things tended to happen to people who asked about Umbridge's, or, as many preferred to call her, Umbridge's parentage. Or anything else about which Umbridge did not like discussing. This, however, was a golden opportunity to destroy the witch's influence. It was a crime to pretend to be a pure BLD, with a mandatory month-long stay in Azkaban. The issue of bribery was merely a gateway to that goal. The true objective was getting a chance to prove, once and for all, that Umbridge wasn't a pure BLD and didn't deserve the pure BLD protections. In all the other cases, there hadn't been enough credible evidence to support what was about to happen. It hadn't been difficult to get Bones' cooperation in this endeavor. She had been trying to catch the slippery bigot for years. The witch wasn't going to win this battle. She was a major blockade to the reforms that Anne wanted in place. She had to be removed. The public discovering the witch was really a half BLD would quickly see her influence erode as pure BLD supporters departed in droves. Plus, it opened up all the other investigations that had been stopped by her use of the pure BLD defense. The prisoner has made an accusation of criminal acts by another person while under Veritaserum, as well as called into question their pure BLD status, Bones stated flatly. That the prisoner believes the accusations to be true cannot be disputed. She must defend her status. Because the accused is present, and the Wisengamot court is in session, we can summarily deal with the accusation. Bones turned to two of the aurors in the room, and nodded at the undersecretary. SCRT the undersecretary to the accused chair. She turned to two others, SCRT Mr. Fletcher to the holding room. His case would be finalized later, a mere slap on the wrist for his cooperation in catching a much bigger fish. By this time, the antidote had been given to the wizard and he was watching with a certain amount of glee. Soon enough, Umbridge was seated, fuming, arms crossed on her chest in the chair. She was glaring malevolently at Bones in front of her. She didn't even wait for a question, stating loudly, "I am a pure BLD, and I categorically deny knowing anything about bribery in the ministry. That spineless thief is lying." She stared defiantly at the Wisengamot. Bones nodded genially. "We will know the truth in a moment." She turned to the auror with the vial of Veritaserum. 3 drops please." Umbridge started to jump to her feet, but Bones hadn't officially declared the questioning finished. The chair's magic yanked her arms to its arms, and restraints immediately snapped into place. There were 2 each over her arms and around her ankles. A 5th restraint tried to snap around her neck, but caught the lower part of her chin on the nearly necklace woman. A last restraint wrapped around her forehead and held her head tight to the chair back. Despite that, Umbridge managed to yell out in fury, "I'm a pure BLD. You can't do this. Purebloods can't be forced to take Veritaserum." Before she could say more, MDM Bones silenced her. After realizing that she couldn't say anything, the witch glared at the head DMLE balefully. Bones just stared at her. Anyone can claim to be a pure BLD. For the purpose of determining the truth of that claim, though, the Ministry is allowed to administer Veritaserum and verify that claim, if it is brought up by a subject under Veritaserum in a court case or investigation. She paused and looked around the room. The only question I am allowed to ask is if either of the accused parents or any of their grandparents, or great-grandparents are a Muggle-born, a half-BLD, a half-breed, or a cursed being such as a werewolf. She returned her gaze to Umbridge. If the answer given is no, then the antidote will be applied. The accusation by the Ministry is dismissed with prejudice, and the accused is generously compensated for their treatment. From the expression on Bones' face, and the way her eyes raked over Umbridge from her shoes to her hair, it was plain that she did not think the answer given would be a no. If the answer is yes, however, I am allowed to pursue the questioning. Director Bones' expression, while mostly blank, had the hint that she expected to continue her questioning. The Minister Fudge had turned quite pale and looked close to fainting. This would be a black mark on his administration, if true, everyone knew. All the decisions that she had made, all the new laws or changes she had supported, would have to be reviewed. Umbridge looked furious and scared. At MDM Bones' signal, the Auror with the vial stepped forward. The chair, reacting to his intent, tilted Umbridge's head back. She stubbornly refused. Sighing, one of the other Aurors stepped forward and used magic to make her open her mouth. Surreptitiously, a third Auror, the one behind her chair, cast a confundus on her to help prevent her resisting the potion. He was a friend of Sirius, and did not want this chance to remove the vile witch's influence slipping through her fingers. Later, that Auror would receive an owl with a gift certificate to a popular restaurant that he had won in a raffle. The Frog Witch's face relaxed and her expression became blank. To the observers, it was apparent that the potion had taken effect extremely rapidly. A quick finite silencio allowed Umbridge to once again speak and be heard. "What is your name?" "Dolores Umbridge," came the immediate and monotone response typical of people dosed with Veritaserum. Bones nodded. "Miss Dolores Umbridge, you are the senior undersecretary to the Minister for Magic, are you not?" "Yes." "Are either of your parents, or any of your grandparents or great-grandparents, either a Muggle-born, a half-BLD, a half-breed, or a cursed being such as a werewolf?" And Bortia, and MDM Bones, knew, as a large number of those present suspected, what the answer to that question would be. Those who were suspicious were not disappointed. To most of the purebloods, though, it was quite a shock. Her struggle was obvious as she tried to resist the potion, yes. Dolores Umbridge then confirmed that she was the first child of a pure BLD wizard, Orford Umbridge. She had blackmailed a clerk in the records office to make her file disappear. Which of your parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents were not purebloods? My mother. And was she a Muggle-born, a half-BLD, a half-breed, or a cursed being? A Muggle. Further questioning revealed that Orford Umbridge, a pure BLD, was a former janitor in the Ministry. Her mother was Ellen Cracknell, a Muggle. She also admitted that her younger brother was a squib, and that she despised both him and her mother. She considered both of them to be inferior to her and her father because of their lack of magic. She explained that when she was 14, her mother and brother had returned to the Muggle world, never to be heard from again. Umbridge was proud of the fact that she and her father had finally driven the two away. The two Muggles hadn't been able to withstand the constant verbal abuse the two had given. Why Orford and Ellen had married in the first place would forever be a mystery now that both had left England, and thought distractedly. But whatever else happened, for falsifying her BLD status so egregiously, Umbridge would immediately lose her position as senior undersecretary. Once she finished the mandatory, but short, Azkaban sentence, she would be lucky to get the ministry job her father had once had. The legal definition of bribery is influencing, or attempting to influence, the actions of an individual holding a public office or someone subject to a legal duty, by the offering, giving, soliciting, or receiving of any item of value or favor, either monetary or informational, MDM Bones calmly stated. She paused a moment, then continued, have you ever offered, given, solicited, or received any item of value, promised to withhold or release privileged information or a favor, as a means of influencing the actions of a ministry official? And could see that she again tried to resist the potion, but failed, giving another, yes. MDM Bones looked around the courtroom. To save the court the tedium of listening to a potentially long list of crimes, I would like the court's permission to continue this interrogation later, and to bring it back to the court at the next meeting. I move we allow MDM Bones to continue the interrogation at another location, and bring the case back later to the Wisingamot at our next session, came the immediate statement from MDM Longbottom. Seconded, said MDM Marchbanks. What does the Wisingamot say? Asked Dumbledore. And barely concealed her pleasure at seeing a large majority of lit wands lifted. MDM Bones, see to your prisoner, and bring us back the results of your interrogation at the next meeting. And sat back and watched as the Wisingamot slowly returned to the normal and boring agenda for the day. It was with no small amount of glee that she watched the shell-shocked, former senior undersecretary being escorted out of the room. Minister Fudge hadn't wasted any time in letting everyone know that he hadn't known the witch's perfidy. He had quickly, loudly, and immediately relieved her of the position. With that obstacle out of the way, her plans for making over the ministry into something that approached fairness for the average witch and wizard had taken a great leap forward. It would still take decades, but a few more entrapments would go a long way toward securing that outcome. Mundungus Fletcher would be well compensated for his role today. His tabs at various pubs would be paid in full, with a bit extra for credit. That last, he didn't know, yet. Not to mention that and could put a wizard of his background and skills to good use in the future, and intended to do so. Competent agents were difficult to find, and she had no intention of allowing this one to wander away. She would be the power behind the minister in a few short years. Then she safely could work on making things equal for every pony everyone. Without cutie marks in the way, only a person's true abilities, skill, and knowledge would matter, and she would keep it that way. The April Easter break could not come quick enough for most of the ponies in Hogwarts. The first ties were dying to show off what more they had learned to their families, especially the non-unicorns. Harry was sure the trips home would be marked by smoke screens, blindfolds, and several other spells shooting from wands all over Equestria. Not to mention that the levitation charm was still a stunner to the ponies who hadn't been at the portal station on either day at Hearth's Warming. As a result, there was more than one double take as Pegasi and Earth Colts and fillies headed for the equestrian train/flow station with their saddlebags floating over their heads, and excitedly demonstrating new spells. For Harry, his herdmates, and his friends the Weasleys were once more vacationing in Equestria. The big news when they arrived was Cranky Doodle Donkeys and Matilda's upcoming wedding. It seemed that was what most of the Old Town residents were talking about, at least. The first day, the twins met with Filthy Rich to check on their various finances and projects. They would never want for money, that was for sure. That, in turn, meant they could concentrate on going through their studies as fast as possible. They told Harry they wanted to take their OWLS a year early, this year. With Hayscart's method, they might even be able to take their NEWTS 2 years early, next year. They wouldn't have time to work on their candies and jokes, but graduating early would let them catch back up quickly. Especially as they would have more knowledge of the necessary subjects at their hoof tips. Harry noticed that his mum had decided on locations for the 2 portraits. One was in the main sitting room, the other was in the map room. Oddly, neither Celestia Painting Pony nor Luna Painting Pony made an appearance. When he asked his mum, she said she suspected that the live princesses had had their second set of portraits finished and that both sets of painting versions of the two princesses were in Canterlot, pranking every pony. Harry and the rest started exploring how much the town had changed. To every pony's surprise, there were now 2 Quidditch pitches at the edge of town. One was a major stadium, the other a practice field. Not surprisingly, they saw the Weasleys' weird and wonderful widgets. Stadium logo emblazoned on the side of that building. Beside that was another logo, declaring Ponyville as the home of the ever-free Flyers. Naturally, there was a complete joke store built into the ground level. Disappointingly, most of the products were actually imported from the wizarding world. Gamble and Japes and Zonko's joke shops might be old hat to the wizarding public, but to the ponies? Pinkie Pie and Rainbow Dash were almost beside themselves with joy at the wide selection. Harry was sure that in a few years most of the merchandise would be from creations by the twins. A separate counter inside catered to the ginger gender gel's demand. They had them in hourly, daily, weekly, and monthly options, with several different prepackaged quantities, including a variety pack. There seemed to be a constant stream of customers at that counter. For the next 3 days, in between exploring the changes, the Cutie Mark Crusaders consultants helped several fillies and colts get their cutie marks. Then, in the middle of the vacation, a bugbear wandered into town and started to make a fuss. The bugbear seemed to be looking for a particular pony, based on how he scrutinized each one he saw before moving on. No ponies were deliberately hurt. He seemed to be especially interested in ponies with a beige coat and dark mane. Harry and the others were watching concernedly as Twilight and the other element holders immediately started planning to subdue the beast. "Do we know what they're talking about?" Octavia Melody said, having come up behind Harry. She had a goldish-gray coat with a dark gray mane and tail with lighter tints running through them. Her cutie mark was a violet-colored treble clef. She was a cellist who lived in Ponyville but was popular enough to get frequent gigs in Canterlot. She was also wearing a bow tie that matched her cutie mark in color. "I'm pretty sure it's about that monster, there," Sweetie Belle said, offering her some popcorn from her oversized bag. "A monster attack." "Blast," Octavia said. "I'm performing at the ceremony this afternoon, and I still haven't sorted out what to play." "Ceremony? Today?" asked Sweetie Belle. "Cranky Doodle and Matilda's wedding is this afternoon, not tomorrow. The invitations all went out with the wrong day." She sighed. "How can I practice with a monster invading Ponyville?" she said despairingly. "Maybe it's just a friendship problem, and it'll all be cleared up in half an hour or so," suggested Apple Bloom, munching on the popcorn. "Ah!" Octavia cried out distractedly, and then dashed off. Naturally, Matilda showed up moments later, all in a panic. "Oh," she said, upset, "Cranky had Derpy Hooves make the invitations, but got the day wrong for the wedding. It's today. I need Pinkie Pie, my wedding planner." Which was when she saw Pinkie try to distract the bugbear with a lemon pie to the nose. "Oh, no. On my wedding day. Semepene's gotta help me. You." She suddenly pointed at a light purple-coated mare with a darker purple mane. "Me?" exclaimed Amethyst Star, looking surprised. "I need to move an entire wedding from tomorrow to today. But no ponies asked me to organize anything since Twilight came to town. So. I used to be the best organizer in all of Ponyville," Amethyst said proudly. Matilda was not shy about dragging the other pony with her as they left the plaza for the salon, moments later. Meanwhile, over by one restaurant, a pony was setting up a table and seating to watch the main six deal with yet another monster in Ponyville. A waitress was bringing out orders of popcorn and drinks. Other ponies brought chairs or pillows out of their stores and set up to watch the impromptu entertainment. Most ponies in the plaza and surrounding streets just moved out of the way and went on about their business. The Flower Sisters, of course, took one look and dramatically fainted. The guards in sight were more concerned with preventing ponies from blocking the streets than anything else. "Nothing to see here," Harry heard one say, waving one foreleg, to small group, move along. Nothing to see here. Harry noticed two familiar, shifty-looking ponies, both yellow-coated with red and white striped manes and wearing blue-striped shirts. They had set up a small table and were apparently taking bets on how long the bugbear would resist. Flim and Flam had managed to sneak back into town. Harry shook his head wryly. The bugbear was putting up a good fight, and was giving Pinkie Pie a head noogie when things started to go crazy. The first inkling was the music they heard. Something like a wedding march but with a heavy beat. In the distance, and rapidly approaching, was a strange conveyance, even by Ponyville standards. Charging down the street was a pair of giant speakers on a wheeled platform, with a table and smaller speaker between them. Behind the smaller table was a white-coated mare with dark sky-blue mane and wearing headphones, DJ Pon 3, otherwise known as Vinyl Scratch. Atop one of the tall speakers was Octavia Melody, playing her cello. Vinyl Scratch had a yellowish-white coat with a mane and tail that were a moderate blue with brilliant cyan stripes running through them. Her eyes were a moderate red. Her cutie mark was the mirror image of two bridged eighth notes. They shot by Rarity's Carousel Boutique, where the bugbear was currently battling the main six, so fast that the small black colt Harry had noticed earlier was revealed to be featherweight. Apparently, he somehow had been coated in ink, which the fast-moving speaker platform had blown off when it went by so fast. Unfortunately, Harry and the rest of his friends were swept up in the process. Harry was certain they were going to crash until he saw Octavia reach out with her cello bow and hook a lamppost. The lamppost should have simply bent, her bow should have snapped, she, herself, should have been pulled right off the speaker she was sitting on. Impossibly, though, the entire conveyance swung around to the cross street. After an exciting ride that could be used in a carnival, they crashed into the town hall. Harmony couldn't miss a chaotic opportunity like this. The ponies flew into the building, landing where they were needed, just as the duo of Octavia and D.J. Pony concluded their impromptu composition. The non-pony-born contingent of the wedding was staring around in astonishment. That was when Bon Bon came in and announced the main six defeat of the bugbear, to the cheers of their friends. Cranky arrived moments later, but with an orange wig instead of his normal blonde one. Stephen Magnet, the sea serpent, arrived with only half of his mustache. No one noticed until later that Derpy Hooves had closed the hall doors just before his mum and the rest of the main six arrived. Harry certainly didn't. What stunned everyone was the appearance in the back row of a changeling. Kevin, as he called himself, said Cranky had invited him. He had the invitation in hoof. And that he was only there for the food. Harry was told later by Twilight that because Kevin wasn't using his magic to hide, and he wasn't trying to force a pony to give him love, he wasn't actually doing anything wrong under the law. It was a bizarre situation in anyone's book. The Flower sisters still fainted, of course. That Celestia and Luna also attended the wedding was another surprise. That they appeared to have no problems with Kevin's attendance kept anyone who might have objected quiet. Nonetheless, the herd had kept a close eye on the changeling for the rest of the wedding and reception. The appealing flowers at the front of the hall turned into equally stunning fireworks when Cranky Doodle and Matilda kissed as Jack and Jenny for the first time. It made for a truly lovely end to the wedding, and the start of an equally wonderful reception. At least Harry and his friends thought so. The cake certainly made it worthwhile to stay. From the occasional expression that he caught, he was sure the three fillies were making a few mental notes. He could only shudder and pretend he hadn't seen a thing. When Lieutenant Castor walked into his office at 9 that morning, he was surprised to see Debbie, waiting. "Oh," he said, "I would have been here earlier if I knew you wanted to speak to me." He moved over and sat behind his desk. "Is there something I can help you with?" Half of the Lings had been integrating rather nicely into MI5 and MI6. The other half, it had been decided, were better suited for support roles. Which, oddly enough, seemed to be research and training. What one Ling learned could easily be transferred to another with only a few minutes concentration while they were together. The original Ling didn't even have to completely understand what she had learned, much like a typesetter doesn't have to understand a manuscript on quantum physics to prepare a book. The destination Ling could take the information and add it to what she already knew. This meant, for a complex infiltration, 3 Lings could be watching or reading the background information while the primary agent worked at physically incorporating any needed new skills. When the 3 researchers finished their respective assignments, they could add their new knowledge to the primary. By the time the agent was ready for insertion, she knew as much about the assignment as if she had spent months preparing instead of a week or 2. They had also discovered that the Lings, excepting the infiltrators, did not know what relaxation meant. They worked until they were sleepy or hungry. When those were taken care of, they returned to work. The concept of free time was foreign when they had nothing to do, they typically just slept. Even the infiltrators were uncomfortable when they had no assignment. The infiltrators were always at work, even when sleeping, when they were among the ponies. Ordinary leisure activities, such as reading fiction, going to theater or films, or watching the telly were futile pursuits to the Lings. Once a Ling had read a book, seen a movie, or anything similar, she shared it with the others and they didn't need to repeat the action. Going dancing served no purpose for them except as physical exercise, although visiting clubs, pubs, and other such venues did provide them with a small flow of emotional food and training in acting like the people around them, which was work, in a way, not recreation. They had discovered that Lings liked physical games, though. The more violent, the better, they seemed to view them as practice combat. Several footy games turned into outright brawls that would have delighted the footy hooligans that traveled to support their teams. Even the Lings otherwise occupied piled out of their training building and joined in, even those who were sleeping. Apparently, a group fight meant the hive was in danger and it was every Ling on deck. They had a mindset several millennia deep where the purpose of any contest was to put down the opponent as quickly and efficiently as possible, but not permanently. You can't feed the emotions off a corpse, now, could you? It was really weird to watch 200 women going at each other like that, at first. Then one changed into a Pegasus and took off. It quickly developed into an aerial brawl the likes of which had not ever been seen on Earth. Especially when they started transfiguring themselves into other Equus races for better advantage when facing a particular Ling opponent. Some of the Lings, many not considered infiltrators or guards, seemed to enjoy the brawl rather a lot, disturbingly like footy fans. The first such incident set the training program back several days as most of the Lings were unconscious or nursing broken bones. They had to dig into their reserves quite deeply for the first time. But they didn't seem to mind, at all. But the Lings were learning to restrain themselves. Until they discovered rugby, the brawl that time was, for the most part, ground-bound, and as men. It took a bit longer for the losing side, and most of the winning side, to recover. Oddly, emotion harvesting seemed to be more efficient, now. After that, Sunday brawls somehow worked themselves into being regular routine. The Lings seemed quite unfazed by their injuries. A few seemed to think the whole point of the brawl was to see how many injuries one could accumulate before passing out. The government had ended up setting up 3 sets of trainers to handle the Lings, which had compressed what should have taken a year into a third of that. The world wasn't going to know what hit it, intelligence agency-wise, that is, when Britain unleashed its new MI5 and 6 agents. The entire group was located at a remote, abandoned airfield, Brunton, in Northumberland County, in northeast England. It was 11 kilometers north of Alnwick, a short distance inland from the North Sea coast. It was fairly remote. With the aid of a dozen earth ponies, a ring of trees and brush now surrounded the perimeter of the airfield, and cut it off from casual viewing from the roads that ringed it. The government, using shell companies, had purchased all the bordering private homes and business properties. At the prices offered, none said no. A little over half the Lings were dedicated to research support. Those were mostly the ones who weren't suited for duties among the public. They were uncomfortable when surrounded by humans and hesitant at doing anything outside of the hive. They were mostly the Lings who had never left the hive, previously. Quite a few preferred their old form over their new default, and so it wasn't unusual to see a black, insect-like pony in the buildings. They had excavated heavily under the buildings and runways to create what their hive As a group, they were all much more comfortable underground in their new tunnels than the wood and brick buildings left over from World War II. Plus, with tunnels to all the buildings, the lings, both human form and insect ponies, were never seen above ground except during the Sunday games. The unintended consequence of this was that the base still appeared mostly abandoned as all the real activity was below the surface. The only signs of activity were the vehicles that transported the research material and personnel to the buildings at the front gates and the Sunday brawls. Just under half of the workers were delegated as first-year spies, 13 were former infiltrators with the others being new infiltrators. The former infiltrators were the most proficient, of course. Almost a quarter of new infiltrators were gathering emotional food for the rest, and stockpiling the excess. Those lings were better at maintaining disguises and weren't liable to accidentally reveal their unfamiliarity with British society, or blow their cover by their actions or inactions in a social situation. A smaller group were assigned the roles of messengers and couriers. They were excellent with disguises, could easily switch between them, and knew when and where they would be appropriate. Their only failing was they were not as quick-witted and able to react appropriately in a given situation as the remainder. They also weren't as ruthless or focused as the other infiltrators might sometimes have to be. The small remainder were relegated to the camp for one reason or another. A ling would do whatever her queen mother ordered. Regrettably, this hive lacked a queen mother, so the order of command was more than a bit muddied. Without a distinct order to do so, getting a ling to switch jobs was problematical. It wasn't unusual for a ling to swap jobs with another without her supervisor knowing what had happened until the new subordinate showed up after finishing a task and wanting a new one. In any case, the more accomplished infiltrators had already rolled up 2 criminal gangs involved in human trafficking, and were tracking a spy ring back to their British handlers. In a year's time the UK could have 51 additional 007 level agents, if they needed. Debbie was the unofficial spokesling for the rest. Abby had disappeared into the Ling support group. She launched into the subject without pause. When we first went through the portal, after we took the loyalty oath, we were warned that a Ling had snuck through the portal within 7 weeks of the Equestrians discovering it. Then, this summer, on August 7th, 3 beings, thought to be Lings, also snuck through the portal. We were told to keep watch for the Lings, or other races from Equestria, and not to let their unexpected appearance throw off a mission if we were in the field and came across them. In the hive, infiltration Lings were taught a special code to use in the field to leave messages and warnings for follow-on Lings in the future. This code would be placed in areas that were easily accessed, and so public as to make accessing the messages undetectable. A Ling could be reading such a message and every pony around them would think they were window shopping or watching colts and fillies playing in a park. Part of our training, here, includes Diagon Ally and its environs, she said. During one of the familiarization missions, yesterday, a Ling came across one such message. She paused to give him a moment to consider what she had said. The message indicates that she has established herself, and left contact information via Gringotts. We are asking permission to contact the Ling. Once we meet her, we will persuade her to take the oath. If we cannot convince her to take the oath, we will warn her that should she break any conditions of the oath, we will consider her a hostile in our hive's area of operation, and act accordingly. We will also leave her a method of contacting us if she should ever need assistance. Castor thought for a few moments. Is there any indication that there is more than herself? Debbie shook her head. No. The message is old, well over a year, probably back to when she first came through, but there are no indications that she has met, or knows about, the others who snuck through. She pursed her lips. Of course, this could be a message from one of the 3 that went through this summer, we don't know. She smiled grimly. Not giving away when she came through, or how many are involved, or even the actual age of a message is typical. She shrugged. Whomever she is, she will want to meet us in a crowded location. That way she can easily escape if it is a trap. None of us would resort to violence in such a location. A Ling in public who doesn't want to be found, cannot be found except by a queen mother. He frowned. And because you don't have to actually meet when in such a location, he mused out loud, she could be anyone in the crowd. Debbie nodded. Whomever you select for the contact will know the other has arrived the moment she comes within 100 yards. We will immediately advise her of the situation, at that moment. If she senses any subterfuge, she will break off contact and you will never see her, or ever find her. She gave him a steady look. If she were to select Harrods, for example, she wouldn't even have to enter the building. The surveillance cameras would leave you with thousands of leads if they even saw her. She could be disguised as a dog or a cat. He sighed. And that assumes she isn't using an illusion of some random person she saw in the city. After a pause, he added, I will have to take this up with my superiors. Debbie just looked at him. Do not take too long. We do not know if she was watching us yesterday. If she were suppressing herself, and already in place, we would never have noticed her. She sighed. A problem she won't have in meeting us. If we agree on a place and she cannot sense us at the appointed time, she will suspect a trap and vanish. Right, he said, straightening. I will contact you later today. He picked up the telly to make a call as Debbie left his office. Voldemort was quite satisfied with himself. Currently, he was in Slytherin dorm, with many of his brethren. Most had, once again, remained at school instead of returning home. Their parents were still trying to find their balance, and were unready to deal with teenagers underfoot. Fools. They should have planned for times when things went against them. They shouldn't have depended on chance that the black fortune would fall to one of their friends. Nor should they have counted on the goodwill of whomever inherited the black family fortune and assets. Goodwill. Ha! They had built their houses of cards on sand. And that didn't count the businesses that had been sold with the new owners refusing to do business with the former clients or associates who had hurt them in previous business dealings. He knew he would have taken advantage of the black fortune to keep the others firmly under his foot. It was foolish of them to think the eventual inheritor would be as generous as the old blacks. They didn't tie up the loose end of Sirius Black, and look where that had gotten them. Many of his old rich backers' families were nearly paupers, now. Their withdrawal from supporting other businesses with sweetheart deals put other conservative families into straining to meet their obligations. Planning for every contingency was the secret. And they clearly hadn't. Which was their loss. It complicated things, slightly, but nothing he couldn't surmount. Plus, as far as anyone knew, he didn't exist. The perfect ploy. In that vein, he had managed to find a secure place for his diary. One that was both hidden, and yet still accessible. He didn't want to deal with having to sneak into the Slytherin house to retrieve it, but he wanted it as safe as possible. It had to be in place where the house elves wouldn't disturb it, nor would anyone think to look there if they were searching for something else. But it also had to be easily accessible to him, or any of his dupes. Plus, in a place that wouldn't attract attention if he, or anyone else, was there. He needed to be able to drop off the book and pick it up at his leisure, and no one would suspect a thing. The library fit the bill perfectly. With a simple Fidelius, and him as the secret keeper, it was perfectly safe among the books on arithmancy. Anyone wandering in those aisles would not garner a second look. Plus, if he was carrying the book, no one would give it a second glance, even if he had it out and was writing in it. Not that he intended to do that. Writing was saved for late nights in his bed, with the curtains closed and spelled shut. Otherwise, he only wanted the boy to carry the book to maintain a light bit of control. Occasionally, Albus made himself comfortable in the private dining room at the Three Broomsticks. His appointment should be arriving at any moment. He had arrived several minutes early so he would have time to settle himself and review what he needed to accomplish. It was a rather delicate matter. It wasn't a long wait. Soon, Rosamerda opened the door and ushered in his guest. The witch she brought in was obviously nervous and unsure of why she had been invited to have lunch with the great Albus Dumbledore. Of course, she had met with him before, in the ministry. But that was usually in his official capacity as chief warlock of the Wizengamot. Lately she had met with him as headmaster of Hogwarts, in meetings along with Ludo Bagman, head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports and her boss. She had changed from the slightly plump girl she had been in Hogwarts, and was now a slim young witch. The surly girl he had seen had changed a bit, although the surly part might have been because she was complaining to him about various situations in Hogwarts, at the time. She had had a reputation of not being very bright, and very nosy. Sirius remembered her and had told him, she was a few years above me, but I still had a few run-ins with her. She was an idiot. Very nosy, but no brains, none at all. She was constantly complaining about one thing or another. Especially about things in which she had no reason to involve herself. The wizard had shaken his head ruefully. If she had kept her nose out of other people's business, she wouldn't have had half the problems she did. Which pretty well matched his own recollections of the witch. Her reputation, now, of being forgetful was something she had not been in school. He hadn't noticed it himself, but a few casual conversations over the last few weeks with some of his more approachable graduated students in the ministry had confirmed the change. That was not a good sign, based on what he had been told by Princess Sparkle. "Good day, Bertha," he said jovially, standing. "It is good to see you, again. How have things been for you in the ministry?" She gave him a nervous look and patted her right hand on her hair. "Oh," she said quietly, "quite well." Then she frowned. "But I seem so forgetful, lately." "Ah, yes," he said consolingly, "it comes from being overburdened. You have so many things to keep track of that you're bound to let a few slip by." He settled back down as she took her seat. He didn't look at his menu, instead giving the waiting Rosamerta a ploughman's platter order. "The fish broth is quite good," he gently suggested. "I found it very filling, the other day." She gave the menu a quick scan, then said, "I'll just have the fish and chips, please." Rosamerta closed the door with a promise to return shortly. Albus smiled at the still nervous witch. "There's nothing, really, to worry about, my dear," he said. "I just wanted to get your impressions on how the Triwizard Tournament is shaping up. I thought this might be a more relaxing venue, where we wouldn't be interrupted. When I'm at the ministry, people just can't seem to stop themselves from seeking me out." She stared at him, blinking. "The French seem to be in favor, the Bulgarians are a bit more reserved," she said cautiously. He asked questions about the tournament, her interactions with other witches and wizards in the ministry, and some of her conversations with the foreign ministries. He probed her surface thoughts lightly with his legilimens ability, listened carefully, and compared her answers with conversations he had had in the ministry with the same people. Several times he had to prompt her response, or correct a detail here and there. They had finished their meals and were just talking when he said, "When you first started working the ministry, you were moved around through several departments, correct?" She nodded. "Yes, it was quite confusing at times. Sometimes I mixed up which department I belonged to, and who the head was." She shook her head ruefully. He nodded understandingly. "Yes, I'm rather familiar with that problem. My chief warlock aides seem to change every time I walk into the Wizengamot." Watching carefully, in several meanings of the word, he said, "At one time you worked in the Department of International Magical Cooperation, with Bartemius Crouch, Sr., correct?" She blinked rapidly, but nodded and took another drink of her butterbeer. "Did you ever have cause to visit him at his home?" She cocked her head sideways, and frowned. "I want to say yes, but I can't recall ever doing that." He caught a brief flash of her standing in front of a ministry floor with a folder full of parchments, then stumbling out without them. Then it was gone. "No," she said more firmly. "I've never been to his house. I did have some urgent parchments, once, but he came to the ministry before I could go looking for him." In her mind was the stern visage of Bartemius, very angry, almost in a rage, his wand in his hand at his side. He asked a few more questions, but felt he had enough evidence to proceed. He sighed sadly. He said, "Now, Bertha, I have something a bit more personal to ask you. Her relaxed state vanished rapidly. Yes, she said nervously, picking up and putting down her utensils, then taking a sip of her butterbeer. A friend of mine has heard a rumor that you might have been obliviated of something, several years ago. She fears that your apparent forgetfulness, today, is merely a side effect of that. She gave him a horrified, disbelieving look. And, I must say, he continued, that some of the things you've said today seem to support that. He paused. I remember how you were in Hogwarts, and you weren't nearly as forgetful as you are now. He gave her a steady look. I'm sure it's nothing, but with this Triwizard coming up, it's better to be safe than to take a chance on an avoidable mistake derailing everything. She mutely nodded, eyes wide. I am a quite accomplished legilimens, he said soothingly. Rather than make a big deal out of what is probably nothing, may I take a quick look at your memories to see if there's anything that isn't as it should be? She stared a moment longer. Is it really necessary? He stroked his beard. Yes, my dear, I truly think this is the best way to handle the situation. I promise not to look at anything personal, only the issue as it was described to me. She stared at him a bit longer, then blinked. She took a deep breath and slowly let it out. Well, if you truly think it is necessary, she said reluctantly, her voice trailing off. He nodded. After another few moments thinking about it, she said, all right. She nodded and straightened herself in her chair. Let's do this. What do I do? He smiled gently. Just relax, and stare into my eyes. Don't think of anything special, just let the memories come as they may. She closed her eyes, took another deep breath, then let it out. She opened her eyes. Okay, she said quietly. His wand was in his right hand, under the table. Legilimens, he said softly. He pulled gently on that image of the stern Bartemius with his wand at his side. The first few images were of the wizard in his office, in meetings, greeting her and dismissing her at the end of the day, and a myriad of others. However, every time the stern, very angry visage started to appear, it dissolved. However, there was enough to the image that he could get the impression of a non-ministry location. While Barty had been angry with her before, regarding details of ministry business, they had always been in the ministry. That particular memory was not. He slowly withdrew and looked out the lone window in the room that overlooked the street in front of the inn. He reached inside his cloak and handed her the small potion bottle. For your headache, my dear, he said, contemplating what he had seen and what he should do next. I am afraid, he said gravely, that it appears you were memory charmed. She burst into tears. He smiled. However, I don't think it was for any nefarious reason regarding yourself. I think you just happened to witness something you weren't supposed to see and someone decided that an obliviation was the proper course of action. He sighed. Unfortunately, they were not a MSTR obliviator, and therein lies the root of your forgetfulness. She looked a little relieved, as she wiped her tears away with her hands. While I'm an accomplished legilimens, he said regretfully, I am not a MSTR of the craft. He smiled encouragingly at her. However, Professor Snape is. I would like for him to give me his professional opinion, if you don't mind. She gave a slow, hesitant nod. In the interests of keeping this out of the public eye, he said consolingly, and to not warn the perpetrator of our suspicions, I think we should handle this at Hogwarts. Should my suspicions prove true, MDM Pomfrey can call for any healers she needs and maintain your privacy. But, she said hesitantly, I need to return to the ministry, there is so much to do. Yes, he agreed, there is much to do, but in my opinion, as chief warlock of the Wisengamot, getting this settled is of higher importance. He slowly stood. I will notify Ludo that I have need of your services for the rest of the day. He paused. If longer is needed, we shall say you are in Bulgaria, dealing with an unexpected problem for the next week. He escorted her out of the room, and they set out for Hogwarts. He decided that while Poppy was getting a proper healer to look at Bertha, he would inform Amelia that he was issuing a search warrant for Barty's place. He would tell her that she needed to conduct the raid, herself, and to take a team with her. The details in the warrant would be that Barty was concealing someone or something important in his home, perhaps under an invisibility cloak. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 57. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author tkepner on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.